What's up, everybody? My name's Adam McDormand, and this is Medium Quality. Alright, I've got a monstrous release to share with you guys today. It is Yes's Steven Wilson Remix box set. This is 5 of what are arguably Yes's greatest prog rock albums, remixed by Steven Wilson and mastered for vinyl. And just to be clear, this isn't just a remaster of the original mixes. These are brand new mixes created by Steven Wilson from digital sources. The mixes on these albums date back to 2013 when Yes and Steven Wilson partnered together to release expanded, remixed, and remastered versions of these classic Yes albums, starting with Close to the Edge in 2013, the Yes album in 2014, Fragile in 2015, and Tales from Topographic Ocean and Relator in 2016. Now, previously, these were only available on CD and digital formats, but the vinyl lacquers were cut by the legendary Chris Bellman at Bernie Gunman Mastering, which means that you should expect a high-quality vinyl release here. The question is this box set worth it? Well, hopefully I can answer that question for you today. So in what was a pretty lengthy process, I spent time listening to specific parts of each album and comparing that to my older vinyl releases with the original mix, some of which I have multiple different copies of. I was listening specifically for places where this mix sounds different than my original mixes on my old records. Because there's so much music on this release, I'm not going to do a deep dive review of the music on all 5 of these albums. I'm going to assume that you're at least tangentially familiar with what is Yes's classic progressive rock period from the early to mid 70s. Let's start with the Yes album. The Yes album is really important because it's really the first place where Yes establishes their classic sound. They had a couple albums before this, but the distinctness, the uniqueness of the Yes sound really has its birth in this album. The original mix on this particular album is really loud, it's really bombastic, more so than the other 4 albums that are included on this box set. And I think in general, it benefits more than perhaps any of the other albums on this box set. One of the things I noticed right away is that this is noticeably quieter than the original mixes, and that has some positive and negative aspects to it. To me, it seemed like there was better separation of sound in this mix. There was a bit more clarity in the instrumentation. A great example of this, the bridge in the first song, Yours Is No Disgrace. There's a part where the drums drop out, and there's kind of a low point in the dynamics of the song. There's this fuzzy bass sound in that part that's much more distinct and clear than that original mix. It's possible that some people will prefer the grittier, dirtier original mix on a song like Yours Is No Disgrace, which is pretty rock and roll. It's pretty straight ahead. But this kind of mix really benefits a song like Starship Trooper, which is much more pastoral. There's more highs and lows that really shine through with a mix that emphasizes clarity over punch. I actually heard things in some of Steve Howe's guitar playing on this album that I don't think I'd ever heard before. Guitar flourishes that just really shine through in this new mix. There are a couple of places on this particular song where John Anderson, the vocalist, hits these high notes that are then panned out. And if you pay close attention to that original mix, it's not a very even descent in volume. Well, that's most certainly a product of analog faders. Someone had to pull that sound down. Well, with a digital mix like this one, that fade out is butter smooth. It's a very minor thing that you might notice, but if you're paying close attention, there are surprises in this new mix for you. Places where different sounds shine through that may have gotten buried in the mix that was so hot originally. Overall, I think this mix smooths out rough edges that I didn't even know was there. Whether you like Steven Wilson's mixing methodology on this album and the others that follow it is really a matter of preference. Well, we have Fragile. which is an extraordinary album where Yes takes that original sound that they were founding in the Yes album and builds on it in surprising new ways. The tentpole tracks on this album are the epic prog rock tours de force that are South Side of the Sky and Heart of the Sunrise. The original mix on this album is actually really good and quite a big improvement on the Yes album. So I was really wondering what could possibly be done to make this album more special than it already is. Once again, the new mix is quieter than the original mix. It's less of a difference on this album because it was treated more delicately in its first run anyways. Because of the fact that this new mix is quieter, there is more clarity in the individual instrumentations because they're not being pushed to peak volume to the point that you lose the delicateness and dynamics of all of these different instruments in these really extraordinary progressive rock songs. So you take a track like Cans and Brams. It sounds sweeter and more delicate. It's emphasizing Rick Wakeman's delicate key work on a song that benefits greatly from a more dynamic and clear mix. Another great example is We Have Heaven, a song that predominantly features John Anderson's vocals. There are points in that song where this crashing cymbal sound comes in. The new mix puts that sound further to the left and further back. I would almost say that the original mix on this song is difficult to listen to because of the fact that that crashing sound is so much louder than anything else. It really throws off the mix in that song. And this new mix, I think, fixes that particular song, one that I used to skip over. Now I would actually listen to and enjoy. I definitely didn't think that the new mix would be able to improve upon a couple of my favorite songs on this album, Long Distance Runaround and the Fish interlude that comes after that. The difference is subtle, but adjustments in the EQ make room for small flourishes that were really buried underneath Chris Squire's brutal, punishing bass work and the loudness of that original mix, especially with a song like The Fish, where Chris Squire brings the dynamics down and you get more sparkling, tinkling kind of guitar harmonic work. That just sounds so delightful in this new mix. And there are layers of atmospheric guitar work that Steve Howe's doing that bring new life to this mix because of the fact that they were buried before. The closing track on this album, Heart of the Sunrise, is a dynamic song with some ferocious highs and really pastoral lows. There are places in this song where Bill Bruford's drum work is just absolutely superlative. The new mix manages to find space for Bill Bruford's drum work to cut through. And I just found that so surprising and delightful that I could hear new things in this song that I've listened to so many times. But it's not all perfect. I do think that some of this newfound clarity and dynamism comes at the cost of some of its ferocity. Either way, I think it's worth listening to. And then we get to Close to the Edge, which is my favorite album of all time. And that perhaps makes me simultaneously the most qualified person to talk about this new mix and perhaps the least qualified person. I say that because I'm intimately familiar with every song on this album, but also it's going to be hard for me to say anything bad about this album because of the fact that I love it so much. This box set marks my fourth copy of Close to the Edge. I have a 1972 original mix on vinyl, a 1982 Mobile Fidelity Sound Lab reissue, the 2012 Rhino reissue, and then I have this 2018 Steven Wilson remix. Since I have so many copies of this album, I started with a focused listen of Track 1, Side 1, Close to the Edge. This is a 19-minute tour de force, perhaps some of the best work that Yes ever did in the studio, and so it's imperative that Steven Wilson gets this mix right. Right away I could tell that this new mix is different than any other version of this album that I've listened to in very subtle ways. There are ambient key swells above the chirping birds and tinkling cymbals in the intro to this song that I had never really noticed before. And right after that, you get to this ferocious battle between the bass and the lead guitar that just crashes into the song. And because it's so frantic sounding, I can only imagine how much of a Herculean task it must be to mix and master this particular part of the song. When the vocals finally do make their entrance into this song, they are clear and present, with some of the vocal harmonies being just a touch higher in the mix than they were previously. And that really typifies this 19-minute opening title track. There are lots of highs and lows in the dynamics of the songs. The high points are reeled in just a little bit to add extra clarity. The low points in the songs are made all the more beautiful because of the fact that they're cooled off just a little bit. Of course, And You and I is an amazing song. I love that song so much, and it's very similar in its mix to Close to the Edge, with lots of dynamic highs and lows. Siberian Kotru, the last track on the album, is a little bit different than the first two tracks. It's a little more rock and roll. It's a song that's much more up-tempo throughout with fewer dynamics. So does that song need to be quieter and more dynamic? Well, there seemed to be this kind of rugged ego showcased in the original mix, as if the bass and guitar continue to fight for dominance of the songs. These are big personalities, these are extraordinary players, and they want to be noticed. Steven Wilson somehow has managed to get them to take turns. And so some of the bombast of this particular song is toned way down. I think this new mix on this album is objectively better. Does that mean that you're going to prefer it? Absolutely not, but it's different. Out of the 4 versions of this album that I have on vinyl, the 2012 Rhino reissue is by far the loudest, followed fairly closely by the 1972 original release. The Steven Wilson remix falls in at place number 3, and the 1982 Mobile Fidelity release is the most quiet version of this album that I have. The quieter the album, the more dynamic the mix is going to be, where everything's pushed down just a little bit so that you have a little more headroom in the sound. That may not be universally true, but that seems to be the case, especially with this 2018 vinyl remix and remaster reissue. We've made it past what is arguably the high point of this entire box set, and now we get to Tales from Topographic Ocean. This is a tricky one for me. In fact, I think listening to this box set was the first time that I ever listened to Tales from Topographic Ocean all the way through. It's the only double LP in this box set, and there's a lot of music here. In fact, the band members themselves have gone on record to say there was a little more material than what would fit on one LP, but not enough to fill both, and so there are places in this album that feel non-essential. Do not take that as a knock on this album. I found lots of really interesting yes moments that I would have missed had I not challenged myself to listen to this entire album. It's definitely not for the faint of heart. It's for the most hardcore of Yes fans. But if you find yourself in that category, then you have to listen to this album. I'm, again, not as familiar with this album as I am with the other 4, and so I don't want to make any assumptions about how this mix differs from the original mix, but I think the characteristics that typify the first 3 albums that we talked about in this review carry through on Tales from Topographic Oceans, where the mix is a little bit quieter, but a little more dynamic. So it trades a little bit of that punch and personality for a more open and separated mix, which reveals new secrets to this album that you probably will not have heard listening to your original reissues. And then we finish up with Relator. I like Relator quite a bit. I kind of think of Relator as all of the magic and wonder from Tales from Topographic Ocean simmered down and condensed to one LP. It's just 3 songs: The Gates of Delirium, Sound Chaser, and To Be Over. Side 1 of this album is probably my favorite. The Gates of Delirium is, yes, at perhaps their most chaotic, and I mean that in the best possible way. There are lots of places where the percussion is very surprising. There's almost like an early jazz fusion vibe, kind of fusing with this really percussive and very progressive sound that they have going on here. The highest points in the dynamics of this song benefit greatly from that reeled in, slightly controlled characteristic of this new mix, especially the places where you have lots of crashing percussion and cymbals, which are all over the place in the Gates of Delirium. It's just really, really nice. I think I heard this album in new ways listening to this mix, and for that I'm really, really appreciative. In summary, overall, this is a wonderful new mix that is different and distinct from the original mixes. I don't think that it needs to replace your original vinyl releases, but I do think that it is worth a listen, even if you just check out the digital releases, which have been available for quite some time already. That begs the question, why buy the vinyl box set? What's different about it? Well, certainly if you don't have any Yes albums on vinyl, this is a great place to start because it's 5 of their best albums, newly mixed and released on vinyl. They're great listening copies. However, I do think Rhino made what are arguably some questionable choices in the physical packaging of this box set. One of the big marketing bullet points for the Steven Wilson Remixes box set is that it features new and reworked artwork for all of these albums. The thing about that is the differences in the artwork are very uneven. If you look at the Yes album, the cover art's pretty much identical to the original version, except along the left side it says Steven Wilson Remixes. But the album art on Fragile, which originally featured this planet against a kind of bluish purple background, is now a planet against a black background. It looks very, very different than the original album art. The original album art for Close to the Edge was this really simple yet striking green to black gradient. Well, now it's kind of bluish purple and at a glance doesn't even look like the same album. Tales from Topographic Ocean looks mostly the same as its original, except that it kind of looks like the really beautiful panoramic Roger Dean artwork is just kind of shifted over a little bit so that things line up differently on the album cover. Very curious choice in my mind. And then Relator, I don't know that I could tell the difference between this album artwork and the original album artwork, except maybe the color tone on that album cover is cooled off. It's a little more blue than the original album art. Between the 5 of them, it's very much a mixed bag as to what got changed and what didn't, and to what degree it got changed. And then the album sleeves themselves, if you look at how they sit in the box, they're not all the same. It's like they got a bunch of different jackets, and so they don't line up. They're kind of jagged. It's a really minor, nitpicky thing, but it almost makes me think that the physical packaging of this was a bit rushed. It's almost as if they didn't have enough time to commission Roger Dean to rework the album art for all 5, and they didn't have enough time to source identical sized jackets, so they just worked with what supplies they had. That's purely conjecture, but that's what comes across in the physical release of this. And at the risk of repeating myself over and over again, that really is a very minor thing. Of course, the most important thing is the vinyl records themselves, and the albums in this box set are pressed to really nice heavyweight vinyl. And certainly there were no expenses spared in that regard. These are great sounding records. So it comes down to one final question. Should you buy it or not? If you're a Yes fan and you don't own any Yes vinyl, pick this box set up. This is a great place to start with 5 classic Yes albums. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're a Yes completist and you already have these albums on vinyl, you still may want to pick this up because I think you may find that this box set is really delightful for its uniqueness and what it reveals about these albums that you may not have heard before. If you're somewhere in between, then this may not be for you. You may have a few of these albums already, but you're not looking to expand your Yes collection, or maybe you're saving money for albums that you don't already have. I would still say keep an eye on this. This is a box set that may come down in price because it's such a niche product, but in the end, I'm really glad that I have this box set. In fact, this will probably be my go-to listening copy of this album for the foreseeable future. Anyways, that's going to do it for this video. I've been talking for a very long time, and I'd like to stop. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more, make sure you subscribe. And if you're really into medium quality, I'll put a link in the description section below where you can get some pretty cool medium quality merch. And until next time, guys, keep spinning that good stuff. What a time to be alive.